Welcome to Chatting Around the Campfire. This week's episode is presented by Red Raider Robotics. My name is Erica.
I'm Flinn, and today we are joined by Jack and Raymen. Raymen is our data analysis lead, and Jack is a member of data analysis. And today we will be talking about what data analysis does, as well as their role at competitions. So let's get chatting.
So, first off, Jack, we already know your story, but Raymen, how did you get into robotics?
Yeah, so ultimately it was in my engineering class where our coach, Mr. Pashy, reached out to me and asked if I was willing to be part of this new team, and it was data analysis, and I took that chance, and ultimately here I am today.
Nice.
And then we know, Jack, you've been on the team for 2 years. Is that the same for you as well, Raymen?
Yep, same as well for me, 2 years.
Year. All right. What has been your best experience overall, your best thing about robotics?
For me, I think it's going to the competitions. I think especially last year with it being my first competition, going to the Wisconsin Regional, I think it was just a phenomenal experience, and I think that's what was the best part of robotics, seeing all your hard work go into action and then seeing other teams compete with you. It's very fun.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you talk about your role on the team? I know it's a sub-team, but please just dive deep into what your section does.
Yeah, of course. So we're still a new team, but I'll probably get to that a little bit later. But generally as a whole, what we do is we ultimately help the team in terms of mathematical needs. So especially if that's anything in terms of gear ratios or finding anything that the team needs in terms of like the math concept. But then really what we stress a lot more on is the scouting aspect. So that's preparing the team for pre-scouting and scouting during competitions. So that's really what we focus for.
And how did data analysis start? Was it your idea? Did Pashy bring it up?
Yeah, so actually Pashy brought it up to me, and I've done like many calculations before, and I think he just admired the way I perform myself with my calculations, and I think that's kind of how it started, and yeah, so hopefully.
Was it a thing before you came to the team, or did you kind of like kick it off?
I actually kicked it off. I mean, the previous captains had the idea and vision of like this is what they wanted, where a team, especially Red Raider Robotics, could have a leader that could scout or a leader that can manage the scouting data and really help the captains and the drive team with the aspects of making decisions and strategies with the data that we collected.
So, in your own words, could you give a definition for what data analytics and data analysis is?
Yep. So it's taking data that we collect from our team and other teams to make rational decisions on the aspects of strategy and scoring and basically creating an alliance with other teams.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add to that, Jack? No.
With that said, I know you talk a lot about competitions and you do a lot of scouting there. What do you look for in a potential alliance?
Yeah, so I think I come from my experience from the data aspect, but I really try to work in tangent with the captains and the drive team. From my aspect, I really look for teams that can maximize our points in terms of scoring. That's what I really value. Now that can come at a cost sometimes with how they perform as a team or how they are in terms of like their game strategy, but ultimately I take on the narrative of which team can maximize their points, whether that be during teleop, during auto, or during endgame, or even a combination of all of those. That's really what I look for, and then I hopefully work in tangent with the captains and drive team, where sometimes it's more valuable to look at a team with better strategy or better drives, or they have a specific design in terms of that's very unique, and I think that's really especially for the games during the competitions can be very unique, like especially this year. It's very focused on the specialties, and I think that's something that I'll have to balance as well with how I value the data and points aspects.
Mm-hmm. You talked about this a little bit, but why wouldn't we just pick the highest seed in our alliance? What aspects do you take into consideration when creating a pick list?
Yeah, so sometimes when it comes to picking just the top seeds or just the teams that are what we'd have in terms of ranking might not always be the best selection, and depending on if we're a captain that's picking for other teams, it might not even play in our favor, where the teams that we originally wanted might not even work anymore. So it's, when it comes to working with data, it's beneficial to plan ahead, and that's really what we do. We utilize the data to make predictions on how our outcomes are going to be when we select these certain teams. And when it comes to that, I think that's how it works and stuff.
Taking a step back, we look at the beginning of the season. How did you set up your lesson plans, and how did you teach the new kids how to correctly form a data analysis?
Yeah, I could speak on that. I think I'd have Jack, especially as a member of data analysis. Maybe he can explain a bit on how I performed my lessons, what I did, and maybe his experience that he felt that he gained when he was learning from me.
Sure. So how that mostly ran was we would be looking at Google spreadsheets, which is where we did and still do most of our analysis. We would be given just like example scenarios that aren't necessarily robotics related of some sort of data that we need to find some quality of, and then Raymen would show us how to do the calculations within Google Sheets so that it can automatically give us what we want. And then as we went on, we would kind of stack onto that, and so then we could have like multiple layers of these numbers determine this calculated variable, and then that determines another thing. And through all that, we could also have it automatically chart our information and help us visualize and make decisions based on that. So I think it was very sequential, I guess, in terms of this function we can use lets us figure out that later.
And how did you go about attracting new members to this newer sub team that we have?
For me, I think on that aspect, I think it's still a small team and it's still being developed, but I really incorporate the aspect where data is really used everywhere. I mean, we're seeing it, especially with our digital age, where even the aspects of social media where they're taking some data information from us and kind of giving it back to us on the aspect. And I'm really trying to incorporate it where it's data is in every aspect of our lives, whether that's in manufacturing, whether that's in marketing and business, or whether that's with programming. It's very intertwined with everything, and that's kind of how I frame my narrative, where ultimately that aspect is very unique and it's valuable. Whether you're in business, it's great to have that the skills of working with spreadsheets or working with data and understanding it. So that's kind of how I advertise it, and I got almost a team of give or take 5 or 6, which is still very well, especially being small and start off. But I think in the aspect, it's very multifaceted, and students understand that data is valuable for their aspects of, even if they're working with business, manufacturing, or design. So.
And incorporating other sub-teams, I think one of my questions is, how much intertwining do you do with drive team or the captains or different sub-teams in Red Rider Robotics?
Yeah, so like I said earlier before, I'll work really close with design if I need to in terms of any calculations. This year it seemed like the team managed it themselves, so that aspect, it wasn't too connected. But I think other aspects, especially when we go into the competitions, it's very close with the captains and drive teams and coach that are there, because it's really the aspect of, here's the data, this is how we should perform, this is what we should do in terms of strategy. So I work really close, especially on the season, during the season, and during competition is when I'm the most active and intertwined with the team. And off season and stuff, I think it's very flexible. I work a lot in tangent with programming, and I think we collaborate there the most. So.
Yeah, so you mentioned your active role during competition. What really do you do at competition? I know scouting is part of it, and what is scouting really?
Yeah, so scouting, Jack, do you want to cover on that?
Sure. Yeah. So scouting we mostly do during the competition, but there's a little bit that we do beforehand. During the competition, we would watch the matches and have people assigned to specific robots to mark down how many points they score and how in the different phases of the game. So end game and auto are included in that. And then we would take all this data to find like how much that team contributes on its own, because that's more important when picking an alliance or when strategizing with that team than just their seed would imply. And I think that it definitely helps us form our pick list much better than anything else. And then before a competition, we look back at videos of other competitions that these robots went to, and we just collect the same information, except it's just in addition to whatever we're going to see at competition.
Obviously, every team has a different strategy. I know there are some defensive robots, some offensive robots. How do you take the data from the defensive robots, because they aren't necessarily doing all the scoring?
Yeah, so what we did last year is we categorized teams in terms of how many of our scouters define them as either a defensive or offensive robot. And when it came to picking an alliance, first off, we selected all of our offensive teams when we were pick list captain, and then from there we had that separate list where we had the defense. Then from there we looked at how much scores, even if they weren't very active in terms of scoring for a defensive robot, but we kind of interpreted that and valued that even if they were a defensive robot or not. And I think coming into this competition for Charged Up, I think it's going to be really unique in terms of not looking at only if they're defensive now, if they have anything that's unique, especially when it comes up that charge pad. What can they do that's either very unique to them, very quick to them, and especially how much they bring to the team in terms of their length or their width and design, because I think if we can get all the robots on there, all three, we can maximize all the points during endgame. And that's kind of what we're looking for, and especially if they're defensive or offensive, that's what we're valuing now. I think the kind of specialty aspect.
And I've seen like a lot of robot reveals where like teams have super creative ways of like either assisting another robot onto the charging station or like hanging half their robot off so you really can get that triple charge, which is a lot of points and that can obviously help you win the game. And you also mentioned defensive robots. I think this year's pretty interesting because like what from the competitions that I've watched so far, like the middle of the field is pretty much like kind of a crazy zone where obviously you're going to the human player station to get more game pieces. This is also off topic. What do you think of the game, like, overall?
You want to give your opinion first, Jack?
Sure. So, I think that it's a lot more, like, there's not as many things in other years as you have to do at a time. Like, in the auto and end game, it's very well defined. The best thing to do for most robots is to try to get on that charge pad, and then for the rest of the game it's placing the cones and cubes. And then that just stood out to me as opposed to other years where there's usually two or more things that you're supposed to be trying to do at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think echoing what Jack said, it's very, very like complex in terms of the game, like the ways you can get points through links or through how you're putting the nodes, whether it's a high, mid, or low, and like you get extra points if you put it during auto. I think it's very, very complex in terms of how the teams can score, and like there's so many unique ways of not just like last year we just shot a lot of cargos, and I think that's how you scored your points. But I think this year there's so many ways you can get points, there's so many ways you can score, and I think that's what makes it so different, especially how teams can like just collaborate better and even more unique ways of winning or earning more points. I think that's what makes this game so different from last year. I think that's what's cool about it. So that's what I think about it.
Why don't you take me through your day at a competition?
So right off the bat, we get in there. We try to get there super early because we want the best seats. Because scouting is very much based on where you position yourself to see the entire field and see both grids, whether that's red or blue lines. So that's really what we start off with. We get early at the doors, and then we find the seats that are the best. And not only that, for the entire team, because we have a big team. So that's one thing that we do right off the bat. Getting there, we usually have our scouters usually sit closer to the, actually not closer, a little further to the back, or where they would like to, but ideally it's in the back so that they can see the entire field. And then from there, depending on what we use for our scouting system, which this year we'll be using Paunage's scouting system, which is like an app, and we're going to be collaborating very closely with Fondy Fires and Oriole Celt, and that's really what we're going to be doing. So that's what a typical scouting looks like. We have a bunch of teams or members that are there scouting with us, and then we kind of talk together. And then from there, I as an individual will either relapse any of the data or scouting information that we collected either every match or every other match that we're competing, and I provide that to the drive team and captain so that they know, okay, so we have these members at our team, this is what they can do, this is how we should strategize before we even get to the match and start competing. So that's really what scouting looks like in terms of a competition. So.
All right, so you talked about using Paunage's app and working with Fondy Fire and Oriole Assault and all that. And like, how do you truly collect the data? Because there's so much happening in the, I think it's like minute and a half matches.
Yep.
How do you make sure you get everything?
Yeah, so for this season, Fondy Fires has created some spreadsheets for us that is already compiled it's already compiling all the data. So really what we use from there is the data that they already extracted and filtered for us and then kind of analyzed already for us. So that's really the great thing about working with other teams, and I think that's something that, especially for our second year, I think that's what we should do moving forward too. So that's how we take all that data. I know it's a lot of data, especially if you're taking 6 teams for every match, and there's almost 80 to 84 matches. It's really it's a lot of data, and I think with what Fondy Fires have already created in this Excel sheet, it's very, very like concise and straight to the point in terms of analyzing all the data. So that's kind of what we, that's kind of how we manage everything.
So how much programming and math goes into your data analysis?
Want to answer that, Jack? Yeah.
Sure. So I'd say a lot of math is used within the data analysis, but we don't like do it manually. We automate it. We have spreadsheets which do the math for us, but you still have to know, like, if you're setting up the spreadsheet, you would have to be able to know that math on your own, which we can do. I'd say that's a big part of it, at least for the scouting part, which I've been working on. And then the programming, there hasn't been a ton of programming, but using those spreadsheets to kind of automate the processes, it's kind of a form of programming, but it's not like the same kind that we would do on programming team.
And you mentioned you don't have to do that math. Obviously, you have to know what to put into the spreadsheet. Like, Raymen, how did you learn all of this so you're able to teach your other members?
Yeah, I kind of learned this independently. I think learning the skills in terms of like financing is kind of how I learned the basics of spreadsheets and how to manage everything. So that's kind of where I started my foundation, and then from there I think I've expanded it and connected towards more FRC and how I can utilize that in terms of data and scouting. So yeah, I really learned it on my own independently. I know there's classes offered at North and stuff like that, but I just really learned it independently through YouTube videos and learning just like how do I do this, and then Google would just show me ways, and I think just that's how I kind of learned how to work it all.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of going back all the way to the beginning of the episode, like once you have all of your data compiled and you're meeting with the captains and drive team, obviously it's going to be a little bit different this year because we're so much more data and it's like so much more advanced. But last year, what was the process of meeting with them? Like, how long did it take? Stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think I met with them every time before they were going to go into their next match. From there, I'd let them know on, I think I said this earlier before, like how their team is performing in terms of like what other alliances they have, and then how the opposing alliance is performing, and then what they should do. And then I kind of, most of the time, I always relapse on how they are doing throughout the entire competition, whether they're improving their skills, whether some skills could be fixed or whatever they're, especially if they modify any like strategy, I let them know, okay, here's how your points turned out in terms of that strategy change and if that should be continued or not. So that's really what I did last year. And let's see. Yeah, and I ultimately talk about plans and strategy with them. So I know that the captains and drive teams usually have a game plan in mind. I'm usually there just to confirm it and back it up with the numbers and say, yep, that actually makes sense because this is exactly what you're doing, so just continue doing it. So I'm more of a verificate. Most of the time I verify exactly what they do. So that's what I.
That's a really interesting way. I never really thought that you could have that integration like match by match. I always thought like, oh, it's the pick list, you know.
Mhm.
But seeing like the data of, oh, this alliance you're going against has a really good defense and maybe one or two bots that score really highly,
Right.
and you knowing how to counter that before you go into the match is like super helpful. And I never thought about that. It's nice.
So when you're at a competition, you sit so you can see the whole field. But do you ever go around and like talk to the people in the pits on like what their strategies are, or?
Yeah, so I know I had another member last year do like what we call pit scouting, which is another form of scouting where you're not scouting the competition, but now you're scouting what the teams do, what they believe they can do, how they're functioning, what their designs looks like. So that's really where you get that aspect of collaborating with other teams in the pits and saying, okay, what are your strategies for this? How are you performing? What do you think you can do? That's kind of what we do with our pit scouting. So that's how we have that. For me personally, I have not done that. My members have done that in terms of scouting. I hope for this year, I want to get back on that pit scouting, whether that's every so often or maybe even starting it off and then having the other half be finished with another scouting member. But yeah, last year I didn't do any of the scouting for pit scouting, but I had another member do the aspects of asking what their strategies are, what their designs in terms of tank, swerve, or if they have any unique specialties. That's kind of what we did in terms of talking with other teams.
And how do you take that into account where you have your data and then you have what the team says? You know, how do you merge those to get?
Yep. So last year, actually, what we did was we kind of used the data that they provided with us to show reliability. I know if a team says that they can like score 100 points and they only score 10, we kind of get a little suspicious with the data, and we usually try to set that team aside in terms of pick lists or even working with them that we know that their performance is not as high as they expected it. But at the same time, we also use the data to make decisions. Like if they're a defensive robot, like we said earlier, or an offensive robot, we kind of take that into consideration with the data, and now we start comparing it with how they are performing as an offensive or defensive player, and then we start comparing them within their own like categories of defense and offense. So that's kind of how we do it, and especially with how like the drive train and how they have that, our captains really like that aspect of if they're swerve, they're a little more valuable than tank, or sometimes tank might even outperform a swerve depending on their scores. So that's kind of how we merge all the data together.
Do you have anything else to
I
add?
do not have anything else to add.
Anything else you guys want to talk about?
No, I think we're excited for this competition coming up, and I think we're ready to use all the data that we collected and are going to collect and make, hopefully, win regionals. That's what I'm excited for.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on
course.
this episode, and we'll see you next time around the campfire.
Awesome.